Very well. My name is Carlos Schickendantz, and I have the desire to collaborate in this online class for audience from different regions. And I will reflect on what is called accountability, submission or reporting. And I'm going to share my screen to show you immediately what I want to offer you. You only have about 30 minutes, so I will try to be as concise as possible. I'm going to share 4 ideas with you. I also have the text in English in red font. 4 ideas. First, introductory reflection on accountability, and with that expression in the current literature as an iconic manifestation of good governance. This is the word accountability. It designates good leadership. A good governance system, an institution with good leadership, is a key cultural word. The second moment, very brief, I'm going to show you an example. Here we're not going to do it from Germany, the example from Germany, but only from Australia, about a text of a report which was not conducted by the Catholic Church, but which is like an audit of how the Catholic Church is operating with regards to the root of the problem of abuse. The third thing, I'm going to show you a kind of diagnosis similar to those international reports not produced by the Catholic Church, but coincide with observations of church reforms that theologians have been carrying out for a long time. And in a fourth moment, very briefly, I will say some precise things about accountability, and I will propose some questions that will help to understand what this accountability is about and what it means for an institution which includes specific leadership. Good. Let's go to the first reflection, the first point in relation to this title, this iconic manifestation of good governance. It's an important word today in institutions. The first thing is that when one starts to study on this subject in relation to the Catholic Church and theology, naturally one has to turn to other sciences, social sciences, and also humanities, right? And more and more studies that come from other sciences also reflect on this accountability, how this feature indicates a good governance, and it is performed in the Catholic Church. A point that the authors always emphasize on is that accountability does not have an easy translation into other languages. Normally, in the Spanish language, is translated as account reporting, but it is always used with different synonyms and often appears united to concepts such as transparency, participation, consolidation, co-responsibility, etc. All of them with different nuances. What they have in common is that they characterize, and this is the point, a good governance and leadership practices in the most diverse and different institutions. The political area, economics, international institutions, and of course, also religious institutions, and among them, the Catholic Church. And of course, one of the points that comes to light when this type of reading and study appears, in here I put it in English, but in Spanish, is that accountability proposes models, proposes a standard that in general are quite different from those in the Catholic Church. A more introductory word Although the concept accountability has a long tradition in political science and especially in financial accounting, it is clear when one has to account for income and expenses in all public administration, but also in international relations, in social psychology, in constitutional law, and the importance of this concept and what it means is growing. And that is why it can be said, what several authors emphasize, that we are before a cultural keyword. And it has become, they say, as in the phrase I used before, an iconic expression of good governance. As if a little word that characterized good leadership, or with words of another author, a crucial element of governance. The typical thing is, as I said recently, is that this applies to all kinds of organizations, even non-profit or non-democratic organizations.
Pero sea por múltiples motivos, por la complejidad de las
Accountability
organizaciones y de la gobernanza,
is
etc.,
but for multiple reasons, because of the complexity of organizations and governance and so on, it is underlined today that accountability is still in its infancy, still in diapers. So you see that by studying the literature on accountability, one sees that double reality. A key concept of growing relevance, but also of great complexity because it applies to the most diverse institutions and so on. Well, I will take a second step and look at the church today. Naturally, the few minutes we have, we can't say much about this, but I want to show you the matter. This will also come up in some way in other videos. This is a text that I share with you here. It is a text by a committee from Australia, constituted by the government, that in 2017 produced a large number of volumes on the subject of abuses. And one of those volumes was dedicated, volume number 16. It was entirely dedicated to the Catholic Church. And in one of the paragraphs, it goes like this. Look, speaking of the church, the powers of government that have diocesan and provincial bishops, religious provincials from religious communities, notice the phrase, they are not subject to adequate checks and balances. Notice what the Australian report is saying. Power in the Catholic Church, speaking particularly of diocesan bishops and authorities of religious congregations, it is like a runaway without controls. There is a lack of a process of an adequate check and balance that is today's so important in all political organizations, economical organizations, etc. The text says there is no separation of power, and the executive, legislative, and judicial aspect of governance are combined in the person of the Pope and the diocesan bishops. Here's a huge question for the Catholic Church, which is the non-existence of the separation of powers, which is something that we describe today as a key issue, so that in institution, justice and human rights are respected. But in any case, look, there is a concentration of power in the Pope, the bishops, the priests, and in the ordained ministry that draws a lot of attention to a person who looks from the outside the Catholic Church. And that's why, strictly referring to the issue of abuse, the text indicates diocesan bishops have not been accountable enough
no han rendido cuenta, no han
they
tenido que
have not been
responder
accountable. They have
ante ningún otro
not
organismo por
had to
su toma
answer
de
to any
decisión
other
del
body
manejo de
for
denuncias
their
de
decision
abuso
making,
sexual,
the
infantil o
handling of
perpetrador.
complaints of any kind of sexual or child abuse or
Esta es la
perpetrators. This
característica.
is the feature.
No ha habido ningún
There has
requisito
been no
para que las
requirement for
decisiones sean
decisions to be
transparentes.
transparent.
Observe
Observe
el diagnóstico
the
y
diagnosis
las
and the
trágicas
tragic
consecuencias de esta
consequences
falta de
of this
rendición
lack
pública
of
es
accountability.
precisamente
It is precisely
el caso del
the
abuso
case of
sexual.
sexual
Esa
abuse.
falta de
That lack of
limitación del
limitation
poder,
of power,
cómo está
of
razonando el texto,
how the argument of the
esta
text is
falta de
reasoning, that is,
limitación
this
del
lack of
del
limitation
poder, de un poder que no
of a
rinde
power that is not accountable.
favorece
This
el
favors
contexto
the
del abuso,
context of abuse,
se produzcan
for abuse to be
y que los
produced
abusos se perpetúen,
and
ambas
perpetuated,
cosas.
both things.
Fíjense qué diagnóstico severo.
Notice what a severe
Es un
diagnosis.
problema no solo moral,
It is not
no
only
solo
a moral
espiritual,
problem,
sino
not
de
only
sistema,
spiritual,
un
but
problema
a
sistemático
systematic problem.
de cómo funciona el
How it
poder, en
works,
este caso,
the
la
power,
autoridad de los
in this
obispos
case,
en la
the
Iglesia
authority
Católica.
of
Y observen
bishops
este
in the
segundo,
Catholic Church. And look at this second text, with which we finish this point, because I can take more time due to lack of time. Check this paragraph. The exclusion of lay people, and particularly of women in leadership positions in the Catholic Church. Look at this, the Australian text. Well, there's not so much, but the Australian text is very, very nuanced. It may have contributed to inadequate responses to child sexual abuse. And therefore, look at the recommendation. According to the contemporary standards of good governance of any institution, of any leadership, a leadership of our time, respectful of people and human rights. We encourage the Catholic Church in Australia to explore and develop ways in which its structures and practices of governance may be made more accountable, more transparent, more meaningfully consultative, and more participatory, including at the diocesan and parish level, meaning everyone. Look at this recommendation. It is clear what needs to be done in order to the reform of the church, to the development of synodality in the church, and also with regards to the issue of abuse. Look at this third point, which I will also touch on quite briefly. What I want to show you here is how that diagnosis, quickly revised now, review now, that diagnosis made by people belonging to the field of politics, law, psychiatry, sociology, it matches, it coincides with theological analysis that has long been done in the Catholic Church. The issue of abuse comes to tell us how urgent reform is, how urgent are reforms in the church, what are substantially included in the synodal process, right? Notice this phrase. I put two sentences. One of them, an American Jesuit cardinal already dead, and the Greek-French Dominican who still lives, one of the greatest ecclesiologists of our time. Notice this phrase of Ebridol's. The current structures of the church, especially in Roman Catholicism, bear the very strong imprint of past social structures of Western European society. So, what does Ebridol says? He's not a political scientist or a lawyer, nor he is a social psychologist. He's a theologian or a cardinal, in this case, very prestigious. The current structures have an imprint on the social structures of Western European society. It's like the Catholic Church fell in love with a form of government, assumed it uncritically, and has not produced a necessary transformation. And that is why Schickendantz says, it remains in practice a mode of government inherited from the 18th century European monarchy, naturally with a spiritual, theological government, but this is the form of government of the Catholic Church. Of course, it is clear there that in this kind of government, accountability does not exist. No one can hold a monarch accountable. No, a monarch works according to their loyal knowledge and understanding. And they don't have to share information, perform consultation processes, be attentive to consensus, and give reports on the decisions they make. Here it is. Notice how the theological diagnosis matches diagnosis like the Australian one I showed. And look, this phrase is so relevant because of time, I can only pick this up. I also turn here to Legalan in a phrase, an article from 2016. Look at the phrase, look. The bishop is never perceived, is never seen as responsible in the sense of accountability, right? To be accountable before his particular church, before his diocese, only to those of higher rank and to God. What do we have here? Look, we have in the theology that still governs the church today, in the widespread mentality and in the practice of government and in canon law, we still have an authority that lacks accountability, which is not obliged to account for their actions, although in some cases upwards towards the papacy, but not in front of the communities that legitimately lives. For example, notice how simple to carry forward, but that supposes a change of mentality. And canon law might state the bishop every year must submit a report to the pastoral council of the diocese on the subject of abuse, on complaints that have come that year, during that year to their diocese, and the appropriate procedures that have been concretized. Why canon law leaves this out? Because it has the concern with a mentality, we would say, so monarchical, of not linking or tying the bishop's authority to the processes of consensus, consultation, sharing decisions. It frees him in the sense that he is not demanded accountability. Notice how important here is not only about the practical matter, but the theological mentality and a responsible leadership per se, which should not answer to its particular church. This is indicating an ecclesiology that is accentuated on the power of government and not on the category of God's people, inwardly focused. So, well, I'm hurrying to the last point. And I want to quickly describe to you
ante la complejidad de la noción
But
de
then what does
accountability
it
y su
include,
aplicación a
given the
distintas
complexity of
áreas
the
e
notion of
instituciones
accountability, its
económicas,
application to
políticas y
different
también
economic,
religiosas?
political, and religious areas and
Un
institutions?
politólogo
A Swedish
sueco
political scientist,
hace estas
he
serían
describes
las
the
características,
characteristics,
diríamos así, definitorias
we would say, that
de
define any
cualquier forma de
form of
accountability,
accountability,
independientemente de
regardless
la
of
institución a la cual se
the
refiere. Por
institution
supuesto que
to
creo que
which
tiene
it
que haber
refers. Of course, there
alguien
has to
que
be
debe dar
someone
cuenta,
who
un líder, un
must give an
presidente, un
account,
obispo, un
whether
papa,
a leader, a
alguien que
president, a
debe dar
bishop,
cuenta.
a pope,
En segundo
someone
lugar,
who must give an
tiene que haber
account.
un
Secondly,
área, un
there has to
dominio
be an
de
area, a domain of
responsabilidades sobre las
responsibilities
que tengo que dar cuenta. Por ejemplo,
to account for
un
example, a
director o una
school
directora de
principal
escuela que tiene que dar cuenta de
who
la
has to
marcha del
account
colegio, ¿no?
for the
Según
progress of the
los
school,
planes, los distintos desafíos de ese año, las
how
reformas
the
que se han
different plans have
hecho,
gone,
¿no?
the
Un
different
área de
challenges of that year, the
responsabilidad.
reforms that have been
Tercero,
made, an
debe
area of
existir
responsibility. And
una
third,
persona o
there
una
must be a
institución a
person or
la
institution
cual
to which
ese agente, esa
that
directora de
agent, that
escuela o
school
director de
principal
escuela debe rendir cuenta.
must be held
Entonces,
accountable,
alguien
right?
rinde
Then someone
cuentas,
gives an
digamos,
account of
a
something
alguien, a otra
to
persona,
someone,
a otra
to another
institución.
person, another
Y esta
institution.
persona o
And this
institución
person or
tiene el
institution
derecho
has the
de
right
exigir
to demand.
a esa directora de escuela, a ese
That school
obispo, a ese
principal,
papa,
that
tiene el
bishop,
derecho de
the
exigir.
pope
¿Qué tiene el derecho
has
de
the right
exigir?
to demand.
Fíjense,
What do they have
miren ahí las
the
palabras
right to demand
claves, ¿no?
of?
A que informe,
But look, and
a que
here are some keywords: to
explique,
inform,
a
to
que
explain, to
justifique sus
justify
decisiones.
their
Eso es
decisions.
accountability.
That's
¿No?
accountability.
Compartir
Sharing
información con
information with
transparencia,
transparency,
explicar, tomar
explaining,
decisiones y explicarlas, etc.
give explanations,
Y un
making decision and explaining them, and so on.
un quinto
And a
punto
fifth
que no
point
siempre aquí hay que
that
ver según la
doesn't
institución, ¿no? Pero en
always,
principio
well,
que
here
es
one
el
has to see an
derecho
institution, but in
que
principle,
tienen
this one,
a sancionar
which is the
a
right,
ese,
they have to sanction that
dirigente,
leader
a ese agente o
or
institución, si no da cuenta
institution if
de
it doesn't, that
del
institution or
área en
leader
la cual
does not
debe
account for
responder, ¿no?
the,
Aquí tienen
or is not
unos
responsible,
cinco
or the
pasos
they don't
sencillos,
account for the
pero que
department they're
describiría
responsible for.
cuáles son los
And
elementos,
here are
¿no? Alguien
about
que
five
rinde
simple steps that
cuenta
describe what the elements
sobre
are.
algo
Someone who is
a otra
accountable for
persona o
something
institución que
to
tiene
another
derecho
person or
a
institution that
exigir,
has the right
derecho a exigir
to
que se le
demand,
rinda
the right to
cuenta
demand
de la forma de
that
actuar
they be held
y
accountable
la
for
posibilidad
how
de
they
la
proceeded,
sanción
and the
si
possibility of
eh,
sanction
la autoridad
if
que
the
lidera la
authority
institución, quien
leading the
preside o la
institution,
institución
who
no rinde
chairs,
cuenta.
or the institution itself does not
Y termino
account
con
for
esto,
what it
no trata
owes.
solo en
And I
español,
am going
traductores
to
pueden
end with this. It's
sencillamente
only in Spanish, but translators
con
will be
algunas
able
preguntas, le
to
puse
simply
así,
put it with
algunas
a few
preguntas
questions.
orientativas clave, ¿no?
I, uh,
A
I,
ayudar a imaginar
I gave
en
some
concreto
key
por
guiding
ejemplo, en una
questions in order to help
institución,
imagine a
también en la
concrete
Iglesia Católica,
situation, or
acá
for
pienso en la
example,
Iglesia Católica, pienso en los
in an
sacramentarios
institution and also in
diocesanos,
the Catholic Church.
etcétera.
Now, I think
Por
of the
ejemplo,
Catholic
la
Church
elección de personas
or a diocesan
se
pastoral
elige por
council.
formas de
For example,
proceder
the choice of
transparentes,
people
¿no? Exige,
is governed
¿cómo
by
se eligen las
transparent
personas, por
ways of
ejemplo, para un
proceeding.
consejo pastoral
How are people
diocesano,
chosen, for
¿no?
example, for a
O para
diocesan
otros
pastoral
cargos,
council
¿no?
or for other
Incluso
positions,
la
right?
selección de
Even the
obispos, ¿no?
election of bishops.
¿Cómo se eligen las personas?
How
Esas
are
formas
people
de
chosen?
proceder son transparentes.
Is the approach
¿Eh?
transparent?
Una segunda pregunta
A
podría ser
second
esta.
question might be this.
¿Existen formas de
Are
rendición
there
de cuentas, es
forms of
decir,
accountability,
modalidades o
say
espacios
modalities
que
or
se
spaces in which
explican y justifican, es decir, pueden
decisions are explained
sacar
and
a la luz
justified,
la
bringing to
argumentación
light
de las
the
normativas de
argumentation
parte de los
behind them
distintos
on part of
responsables áreas del
different
gobierno? El que
heads of
lidera
government
frecuentemente tiene el
areas?
derecho a tomar
The leader often
decisiones,
has the right to make
pero
decisions,
tiene el
but has the
deber
duty
de
to
explicar esas
explain
decisiones.
such
Tiene que
decisions,
explicar la justificación, tiene que compartir
has to
información.
explain justice,
¿Por
has to
qué
share
motivo?
information.
¿Cuál
Why?
es el
What
argumento
is the
que te
argument
motiva
that
a tomar
leads
esta
that person to make
Eso es muy importante
that
esperarlo
decision.
del Papa,
That is very
de los
important to
obispos,
expect from the Pope,
presbíteros,
from the
de
bishops, from
quienes
priests,
legítimamente, de todos
and
quienes
from those who
ocupan formas de
legitimately occupy
liderazgo
a
en la
form of
Iglesia.
leadership in the church.
Tomen las decisiones que les resultan
Make the
legítimas,
decisions that are
pero
legitimate for you, but
transparenten
transparent.
sus decisiones, expliquen por qué
Explain
las toman, ¿no? Por
why
esto el asunto
you're
clave
making those
es
decisions. Therefore, a
compartir
key issue is to
información,
share information.
esconder
Hiding
información,
information,
retasear
withholding
no
information,
compartir
not
información,
sharing
es
information,
una
that's
práctica
an
extremadamente
extremely
viciosa,
vicious
y muy
and very
contraria a esta
contrary
forma de
practice to this
liderazgo que
form of
estamos
leadership
hablando.
that we are talking
La
about.
práctica habitual de
The
compartir
usual
información.
practice of
Es
sharing
verdad que no
information,
todo
it is true that
puede
not
decirse
everything can be said
cuando se refiere
when
a
it
una
refers to
persona,
a certain
pero
person
debe ser muy
and so
clara
on,
que
but it
la
must
línea
be very
en las
clear that
orquestas de liderazgo donde un gobierno
direction and leadership
es de personas que comparten información,
of
porque
a
compartir
government, of an
información es
institution, is of
compartir
people who
poder.
share information, because sharing
Permiten que
information is
otros
sharing
miren
power.
y revisen
It is allowing others
nuestra
to look and review our
y
institution.
por eso son tan
And that is why
importantes
periodic
mecanismos de
evaluation
evaluación
mechanisms are
periódica.
so important.
Las personas
People
que
who
ejercemos
exercise
cualquier
any
tipo de
kind of
liderazgo
leadership
debemos ser
must be
personas acostumbradas,
accustomed to
personas que de buen
willingly
grado
submit to the
se
gaze of
meten a la
others,
mirada de los otros, sea en la institución que sea,
regardless
un
of the
obispo que preside una
institution,
diócesis, un presbítero que preside una
whether it's a
parroquia, un
bishop
director de
presiding over a
escuela que
diocese, a
preside una
priest
organización.
presiding over a parish, or a school principal presiding
Y
over
este
an
otro punto
organization,
también
and
es
so on.
importante, ¿no?
And this is other
Pensando en la vida
point
de la
that is also
iglesia,
important.
compartir
Thinking
información
about the
con
life of
otras
the church,
instancias del
sharing
mundo
information
diocesano.
with other
Por ejemplo,
instances of
quienes
diocesan life.
formen
For
en los
example,
seminarios
those who
los
train
candidatos al
candidates for
ministerio
priestly ministry in seminaries,
presbiteral, ¿no?
of
Claro,
course,
son
they
directamente
are
responsables
directly
de la
responsible for the
formación
formation of
de los
priests, of the
presbíteros de una
priests of
diócesis.
a diocese.
Deben compartir
They must
información
share
con
information
toda.
with
Es un
everyone.
asunto de toda la
It is a
diócesis,
diocese-wide affair, right?
no solo de ellos.
Not only theirs.
Por eso la información no
That
es
is why
solo
the
a los que
information
pertenecen
is not
inmediatamente a la
only
misma institución, sino al
of those who
conjunto
immediately belong to the same
de la vida
institution,
diocesana.
but to the whole life
Por
of
ejemplo, aquí un punto
diocesan
clave,
life.
tampoco está en el derecho.
For
Todos los
example,
años debe haber un
here
informe en la diócesis
here's a key
pública
point which
sobre
is
cómo se
not in the
maneja
law
el
either.
dinero, la finanza.
Every
¿Ven?
year
Es un liderazgo
there should be
evangélico
a
a
public
modo de
report,
Jesús,
the
pero
diocese
según
about
los estándares de nuestro tiempo.
of the diocese about how
Se
money and
debe
finances are handled, of their evangelical leadership in the manner of Jesus,
acorde
but by the standards of our time, double criteria according to
y
the gospel,
dos últimas características,
according
debe haber
to humanistic standards of our time.
formas en
And
que
two last
las
features.
personas de una
There must be
comunidad
ways in which
puedan
people in a
presentar
community can raise
objeciones,
objections,
quejas, pedir
complain,
explicaciones.
ask for
¿Por qué se tomó
explanations.
esta decisión?
Why
¿Por
is
qué
this
se nombró esta
decision made?
persona? ¿Por qué se hizo este
Why
gasto?
was someone else
¿Cuál es el
appointed?
plan
What was this
del
expense
proyecto de
made? What is the plan of the
catequesis?
ministry to divide
Etcétera,
the
etcétera, ¿no?
catechesis
Tiene
project,
que haber
etc.,
formas
etc.? There
previstas
has
y
to
no
be
solo
planning.
dejadas, esto es
This is
clave,
key, not
no
just leaving
solo
things to the
dejadas a la
goodwill
buena
of
voluntad
the
de quien
leader,
gobierna, sino
rather
formas previstas,
plan
incluso
activities,
jurídicamente.
even legally, right? And
Y por eso una de las
so,
preguntas final que puede
one to the
orientar
final question that can guide an
una
institution
institución que
that is
bien
well
liderada,
led,
bien gobernada,
well governed.
es si las
It is
distintas
whether
fases
the
de una
different
comisión
phases of
histórica están
accountability are
presentes en la
present
conciencia de
in
los
the
miembros
consciousness of the
de todo el
members of an
espacio
entire
eclesial.
ecclesial
Todo el
space.
pueblo de Dios
All of God's
¿sí?
people have
Tiene derecho
the
a estar
right
informado,
to
a
be
participar,
informed,
a compartir
to
decisiones,
participate, to share decisions.
etc. Todo el pueblo de
All of
Dios es
God's people are
responsable
responsible for the
de la
life
vida
of
de
the
la
church
iglesia
in
en,
each
en cada
region.
región, ¿no? Y esto, como les
And
digo,
this,
eso debe estar
as I
regulado
say, must be
jurídicamente.
legally
No pueden
regulated.
ser iniciativas
They
dejadas de una
cannot
mera
be
voluntad.
initiatives leaving
reformas de la Iglesia en el siglo XX
left to the mere will,
o son reformas
the reform of the church in the 21st
también
century.
jurídicas,
Either they are legal reforms
no
or they
son
are not
reformas eficaces.
effective reforms,
Esto
right?
es importante
This
para
is,
toda
this is important for
el proceso sinodal de
the
la
whole
Iglesia. No solo conversión
synodal
personal, por
process of the church, not
supuesto,
only personal
conversión espiritual,
conversion, of
personal,
course,
conversión
spiritual
pastoral.
and
Esta conversión
personal and
debe
pastoral conversion, but
plasmarse
that conversion
en la
must
forma
take
como
shape
esta
in the
comunidad
way this
se organiza,
community is
cómo se
organized, how
gobierna,
it's
cómo
governed,
procede.
how it proceeds.
Bien,
Very
esto es un
well.
rápido panorama
This
sobre
was
esta
a
palabrita
quick overview
clave
of this little
que
key
naturalmente en
word,
la Iglesia Católica hoy no tenemos
which
que
naturally
asumir
today in the Catholic Church,
acríticamente,
we do
copiando
not
modelos
have to assume
políticos. No,
uncritically
de ninguna manera.
copying
Tenemos que
political models. No, not at all.
nuestros
We
criterios
have
es ante
to,
todo el
well,
Evangelio,
our
pero
criteria are
aprendiendo
first and
de las
foremost
formas
the gospel, but learning from
político-culturales
political, cultural
de
forms
nuestro tiempo.
of our time.
Y
And
accountability, desde ese
accountability
punto de vista,
from that
es un
point of view
asunto
is a key issue
clave para la reforma de la
for the
Iglesia, para el
reform of the
proceso de
church, for the process
sinodalización
of
en
synodality,
el
which we
curso que
are
estamos conversando.
talking about here.
Muchas gracias.
Thanks.